Very kind words. Thank you very much, Barry. And very generous, excessively so, really, well, definitely so. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege, really, to be invited to address you and in the Bruges conference. Last time I addressed this conference, I was given a regular mauling. I can't remember what I did wrong, but I certainly suffered for it. So I expect I'll put my foot in my mouth again, because, so feel free to have a go. Let me just, I won't say too much, but let me say that I'm not going to say anything about the law or the courts or what we do about it. I'll leave that to others who understand these matters. I'm going to stick to the basics and the economics, really, which I think I know a little bit more about. So I think the first thing was, what was the Brexit vote for? I think it's very simple. It was to take back democratic control of our country. Very, very simple. And, our laws and, of course, by implication, our borders. And of course, in 1972, when we joined the EEC, we were told that there was going to be no overriding of our democracy. It was going to be a trade relationship. And, of course, that was that was economical with the truth. And it's turned out very different. And that has been the problem, really. That has been the problem. And people say, well, that's a political thing. Of course, it is a political thing, but it's also an economic thing, because if you control your laws, you control your economy and the way in which you do business. And that's really important for us, of course. We want to be a prosperous country. And what we discovered was that within the EU, there were a lot of problems with the conduct of our economy. And, of course, we had no way, because that's primarily what the EU was about, though, of course, it's got more and more ambitious to control more and more aspects of our life, which is obviously another problem. But on the economy, where it had these huge powers over us, the problem was that it had no accountability. Nobody could tell it to change course. Obviously, the euro has been a complete disaster. They had no way of dealing with the problems that it created. And what are they doing? They're trying to solve it on the hoof by doing more of it, more Europe. The answer to every problem in Europe, I was told by European politicians, is always more Europe. And obviously the answer to the disaster of monetary union was a lot more Europe. And so if you go to Europe today and ask what are they doing, it's an alphabet soup of committees and councils and this and that, all ending with the word union. Banking union, every sort of union. Now, the problem is that this is imposing a lot of costs on us, and that brings us to the economics of the EU very much up front. Why is the economics so wrong? And there are basically three big things that the EU does that damages our economic interests. First of all, it's highly protectionist, and this has been sort of, on the Remain side, they never mentioned this. They never mentioned the Common Agricultural Policy, which raises food prices 20%. They never mentioned the Customs Union, which raises manufactured prices about 20%, mainly through non-tariff barriers against cheap labour countries. And those are big items. If you get rid of that protectionism, it lowers our cost of living 8%. Now, 8% is a big number, particularly for poor people. 8% off food. 8% off the Consumer Price Index is just for the average person. But 20% off food is very big in the budgets of poorer people. And so the EU is very bad for poor people because of its protectionism. That's kind of a big item. And when you get rid of that, it has a dynamic effect on the economy because consumer prices come down, and you get the economy into a better shape because the parts of the economy that are not dependent on protection, grow faster than the parts that do, and you get a better economy, a better shaped economy, as well as consumers being a lot better off. And that's the central motor, really, behind the good result if we leave the EU. Now, the second big motor is regulation. The regulation done by the EU is incredibly top-down, dirigiste regulation, and it goes into all parts of our economic life. When we're in the EU, we can't just have regulations on what our product standards are and so forth. We have to have regulations on everything, on finance, on the labour market, on energy and climate change, and on products. All the products we produce in our economy are regulated by EU regulations. Now, when Mrs. Thatcher got the single market going for Monsieur Delors in the mid-80s, the idea about regulation was there would be mutual recognition of standards across countries in Europe. And so we'd have our regulations, Germany would have theirs, etc., and we'd just do business together on the basis that the other guy's regulations was as good as yours. That all went very rapidly, and it became uniform regulation, top-down, very interventionist. And we reckon that the costs of that are probably the biggest cost of all of being in the EU. Something between 6% as we've experienced so far, going up to very much bigger numbers if the EU really kind of cut loose in a sort of socialist direction. I can remember when the first commissioner of the social market, it was called, was a Greek lady, and she just wanted to bring in communism, basically, as fast as possible. Well, that would have been pretty damaging, wouldn't it? Luckily, she lost her job fairly quickly, and it didn't quite turn out as bad as that, but it could do. And what a lot of people don't realize is how socialist and interventionist the whole political economy of the continent is. I mean, I won't say all my best friends, but a lot of my best friends are European economists. I know these guys. I know what they get up to. And they want to control you. That's the bottom line. And so this is a big item, EU regulation. And by getting back to our own regulation of the city, of energy, the labour market, we'll get back to the sort of pragmatic, practical, pro-business, but balancing it off with, the human element, which is what we've always done. Now, the last element, which I think is very important and has to be understood because there's so much disinformation about it, is immigration. Now, when during this campaign, the Remainers always said, immigration's great because, the average immigration, brings in a lot of income and so on. But they missed the point. No one is against skilled immigration. We need skilled immigration. Skilled immigrants bring skills, they bring value, and they pay a lot of taxes, which easily pays for the costs of the welfare benefits that we give them. However, unskilled immigrants are a very different story, and unlimited entry to unskilled immigrants. Actually, you mentioned Milton Friedman, Barry. He was one of the first that said no country with a welfare state can afford to let unlimited numbers or any numbers really, of unskilled immigrants in because they cost more than they bring in. We did a calculation, which we've now refined, and I think is reasonably accurate, that every adult unskilled immigrant from the EU costs us $3,500 a year, the taxpayer. And that's because, if they came in, and I know John Knotts want to say something about this, if they came in without any dependents, that'd be okay because, they pay a bit of tax and they pay their way. And a lot of farms require unskilled immigrants to help with the harvest and so forth. But the problem about the basis on which they come into this country is there's no limits on their rights. And obviously they can bring in as many, their family and all the rest of it. The problem about that is that that creates a huge welfare bill. And one has to be quite upfront about this, because that, of course, that welfare bill lands on the doorsteps of the poor communities of this country where they settle. And what's more, just to add insult to injury, the unskilled workers in that area find their wages drop. So this is very important, of course, and a very big element in the cost. And this adds about £6 billion to the cost of the EU. And it's kind of also, obviously, very, very much of an issue politically. So those are the three things: protectionism, regulation, intrusive regulation, and the issue of unlimited unskilled immigration, which is clearly expensive and potentially very much more expensive as you go forward. So that's the background for why we wanted to be out of the EU, and why, the arguments of the Treasury, which was Project Fear, if you leave the EU, you'd be really worse off, were complete reverse of the truth. I mean, if we leave the EU, we're a lot better off. According to our calculations, well over 100 billion better off, if you like billions. I don't know, a billion or two doesn't mean a lot to me. Probably not a lot to you. For what it's worth, it's a lot of billions. Anyway, being out. So then you get to the nitty-gritty question. How do you get out? The options for Brexit. And this is, of course, where the Remainers have tried to frustrate the process, because they said you should go for soft Brexit. Norway, European Economic Area Brexit. A problem about that is it doesn't achieve the job. In order to have a soft Brexit, a Norway type of arrangement, or any of the variants on that, you have to submit to the laws of the single market, all those regulations I talked about basically, and you also must have free migration. So everybody kind of, I think by now, this has been quite a lot debated, knows that, and therefore the so-called soft Brexit EEA option is not really an option at all in terms of the vote. It just doesn't achieve the job. Basically, it's the status quo. We stay in the EU. Yeah. And so all the costs are the same. All we've done is have a referendum with a lot of expenditure of, blood, sweat, and toil, with a result that people wanted, to be completely frustrated. Of course, that is really what this court thing is all about. It's about forcing that back onto the agenda and saying, well, that's what we'll have. Okay, so what's the alternative? The alternative is a clean Brexit, where you leave the EU straightforwardly, you leave the single market, you leave the customs union, you just leave the whole shooting match, and, of course, you get the gains. Now, then the question is, you see, which is obviously a big problem in practical terms, how do you then, what sort of relationship do you have with the EU in terms of cooperation in trade? One possibility is that the EU is very reasonable and does a free trade agreement. That's to say, it gets rid of all its tariffs against us, and we get rid of all our tariffs against them. And then we would go on, because we would be outside the single market, and do free trade deals or get rid of our barriers against the rest of the world, either unilaterally or we might do a few trade deals, with more prominent countries. And that would all be agreed with the EU. Now that would be a wonderful world of reason. And, one would hope that it would happen. The trouble is, the EU at the moment is riven with disagreements, and we've just seen the Canadian trade agreement, which was held up by Wallonia. Does anyone know where Wallonia is? I have a Belgian friend, so I had an unfair advantage. But anyway, it held it all up, and, in the end, the Canadians cut stuff out, and they all got to agree. And the difficulty, unfortunately, there's 27 countries. The EU is now, Commission is quite weak, and that's why it allowed the Canadian agreement to become unanimous, because it just didn't think it could force it through. So, as they used to say at school, a fortiori, dealing with Canada's a nothing problem. Dealing with the UK is the problem for Europe at the moment. They want to punish us. And what's more, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, et al., they want free migration. And we don't really know that there's any mechanism by which, something that they don't agree to can be agreed, because they may well have a veto. In other words, we really don't know what the EU will come up with in the way of agreement. Now, there's certain things that they've kind of got to agree to, like how you do customs recognition and how you do tariffs on inputs, on car parts, for example. Because if they don't agree on anything like that, they'll destroy their own car industry, and they'll just destroy their own industry, because, without customs nuts and bolts working in a reasonable way, everyone gets destroyed. And that's what you might call mutually agreed destruction. Mad. And so I think we can assume that they won't go mad. But it is possible that we won't be able to negotiate, a full trade agreement, because someone or other, or maybe many, will insist that we have to have free migration and that we have to have subjection to the EU regulations. And if that's the case, it just isn't acceptable, you see. It is not an acceptable deal, because it violates the whole idea of Brexit. So I suppose the big question is, what do you do if you can't get a deal other than on these mad things? Suppose they insist that you're going to have the general tariff of the EU, you see, and we say, well, what do we do about that? Will we put the tariff on you? I think at this point we can be practical and say, actually, we can cope with that. Provided none of the mad things happen, what I call the nuts and bolts of trade relationships, of which there are an awful lot that have to be agreed on a technical level, really. Otherwise, you bust up supply chains, you bust up trade generally. If we kind of put that on one side and say there won't be any mad stuff, on the kind of central thing is, do we sign a free trade deal with the EU? It may well be we can't, because of the things I've talked about. I don't know. What do we do if? We have to have a strategy. What do we do if? Well, what I would say is, don't worry about it too much, because the tariff rate, the average tariff rate on manufacturers, as I'm talking about here, 3.5%. Cost of the tariffs we pay going into the EU, 3 billion. Now, $1 billion's a lot of money to you and me, but I have to tell you, it's chicken feed in this debate, because we're going to gain 100+ billion. And what I would say is, don't let's fuss about that too much. Let's not put tariffs on them. Let's have unilateral free trade, which is the sort of thing we did in the 19th century and was pretty good for the world and for us. Let's have free trade with everybody else and generalize that to the rest of the world. And if the EU are stupid enough to put a 3.5% tariff on us, well, we can help our own manufacturers pay it. I mean, we can't do it up front, but we can help them in various ways to absorb the cost. And that's what I'd recommend. I wouldn't recommend getting into a tit-for-tat thing, because for us, the big gains of leaving the EU is to get rid of protection. It'd be really stupid if, because we had some sort of fights with all sorts of people, we said, oh, we're going to put big tariffs on you because, and try and persuade you, tit-for-tat warfare. Trouble about that sort of tit-for-tat warfare is it damages you. Our best bet's to just say, look, we're in favor of free trade. We go to that unilaterally. If you're stupid enough to put a 3.5% tariff on us, we can absorb that. Actually, Sir James Dyson said that more or less the other day. He said he wasn't bothered about any of that. And rightly so, because it's a small amount. we can actually effectively deal with that for the whole of British manufacturing without raising a sweat. And so that's what I recommend. And that's really at the heart of the big sort of struggle that's going on with the Remainers. They're saying, we've got to be in the single market because otherwise, terrible things will happen, like they'll put tariffs on us, you see. But they haven't done the numbers. The numbers are pretty small. And as I say, if you rule out the mad stuff, which no one's going to do, you're left with these tariffs which are pretty trivial. And so I would say don't let that worry you. It's no reason to go to the EEA option. We can do the proper one, leave the single market, leave the protectionist union, put our own free trade, zero open economy to the rest of the world in place, and absorb anything anyone else does. And we don't need a free trade agreement with the US, for example. Do you know we've traded with the US ever since it existed? I think that's a few hundred years. We've never had a trade agreement with the US. Never. And there's masses of trade. The US is our biggest trading partner. And we've never had a trade agreement. So forget all the stuff about trade agreements. Don't worry about the EU. Let's go for the thing that suits us.